Advancing the cause of liberty takes more than just coming up with ideas. It means making them happen. This is Society and the State. Life, liberty, and your pursuit of happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to episode 42 of Society and the State. Connor Boyack here alongside Brian Hyde. And I just realized, isn't 42 like the ultimate answer to life and the universe and everything from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? So maybe it's appropriate that we're talking about what we are today.
I just saw that equation for the first time in a meme on Facebook, but didn't understand what it meant.
It must be true.
You've actually shed light on something that was kind of lodged there in my mind. I was wondering about it.
If it's in a Facebook meme, it is the source of all truth. So today we're talking about the virtue of the black market. Now, this is a controversial topic for those who are prone to regulate, prone to control. But I want to talk with Brian here about the black market, what it is, how it works, why it's important. And let me start maybe the discussion this way, Brian. Do we have a free market?
In some ways, but no, we do not have a free market in the sense that government interference is absolutely minimal.
So what do you mean in some ways? What are some ways that we have a free market?
So there are still a few areas where you and I could perhaps transact voluntarily without government interference or needing some kind of a permission slip or otherwise have to jump through some bureaucratic hoops. But the circle of things that we're still allowed to do is considerably smaller than it was even just a few years ago.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a good point, right? So in some settings, some scenarios, some transactions, there is relative freedom or even potentially absolute freedom. But those instances are probably fairly minimal, right, with how large the regulatory state has grown. And so to speak broadly about a free market, I think it's fair to say that it doesn't really exist. I think we like to say, oh, you support the free market. Well, I think it's better to say we support a free market because there is no the free market. You can't support something that doesn't exist. And so we would support a free market. We support policies that free up the market, but I don't think it's correct to say we support the free market because it presumes that it actually exists when it doesn't.
So black market, though, has kind of a scary connotation. And I'll admit, the first that I ever heard of the black market goes back to when I was a little kid watching reruns of Hogan's Heroes on TV, and they would talk about how, well, we bought these bombs on the black market.
Right.
So I always associated, well, the black market must be where you get things that are really, really bad or things that have to be very, very secretive. But it turns out that may not necessarily be the truth.
And maybe here's a modern analogy or example of what you mentioned. So Bitcoin is a great example of people directly transacting, true free market in many respects. And you're right, the black aspect of the black market or free market does have a negative association with it, much like within the Bitcoin world, you had Silk Road, which was this online marketplace, where people could offer things for sale that were illicit, illegal, even evil, right? In some cases, you can hire people or could hire people to ostensibly assassinate someone and so forth. And so, yes, I think in the black market where you don't have that regulation, you do get people offering goods and services that as a society we might want to condemn. And they might try and do it with enough anonymity where they can still transact, but they can do so successfully without having regulators or the police show up. But I think in most cases, let's continue the Bitcoin example. Yeah, Silk Road existed. And yeah, some people bought illegal things or did illegal things. But I think writ large, the good that Bitcoin does, think alone just from remittances of immigrants to families back home, avoiding not only the Western Union transfer fees and so forth, but even taxes and government taking its share when they can directly benefit their family in another country. That is a net positive. That's a wonderful thing. And so I think the positive use cases in a black market probably outweigh the negative ones. Would you dispute that at all?
No, not at all. In fact, okay, not to sound conspiratorial, but I think sometimes we're shepherded into a corner where we're told to think of anything that's black market or anything that's not regulated or otherwise under the state's control is somehow suspicious. But this, when we talk about the black market, it can take on some very benign forms in addition to, the other extreme, which would be the shady stuff on the Silk Road.
The example that I think of, well, I've got many examples that I'd love to talk about today, but the one that just popped in my mind is I'm a beekeeper. and I'm an illegal beekeeper because my state requires you to tell the state how many hives you have and where they are and register and pay a fee, and I don't do any of that. And so and then I sell my honey, which you need technically I think you need a cottage food license and you need a business permit, and I don't do any of that. So that's a black market, right? And so I think the virtue of the black market is such that we're actually creating or operating in a free market. It's one that's not legal. It's verboten. We're supposed to, be paying our fair share and so forth. But I think many people transact in this way. If you look at Uber, for example, Uber intentionally operates or operated, depending on your jurisdiction, in a black market to force the hand of, city and county councils. I'll use a specific example. Here in Salt Lake, where we're based, we interviewed a woman, single mom, who started driving actually with Lyft, Uber's competitor, right? But the same situation was happening. And the city fined her $6,000 for driving without being a taxi, basically without having their permission, because they had regulated and controlled the entire industry near the airport, of course. And so $6,000. And so Uber and Lyft, they were telling these drivers, don't worry about it. We will cover the cost of the citation. Keep going. And so what was happening was they were operating in the black market. They were transacting with people who welcomed and enjoyed these services. They created enough of a constituency of a market of people who loved, using Uber and Lyft here in Salt Lake City. And when they had paid a ton of fines, right, they were then able to go into the county council, and they had all these people wearing their T-shirts, all these people excited because they had participated in that black market. It's like me selling my honey to, hundreds of people, even though it's illegal, and then I get those 100 people to go storm City Hall with me, and now we can make a change because we built that up. That can't happen unless you are transacting in the black market.
Having partaken of some of your honey, your illegal honey, and actually seeing the response, I've seen people who came to when it was available, for a short season. I've seen people love Connor's honey. I've also had the privilege of taking Uber and Lyft for transportation to and from the airport, and it's an order of magnitude better than any taxi cab ride I've ever had in my life.
Right.
So these are legitimate needs that are being met. No one is being harmed. So now I'm left to wonder, why would this be illegal, or why would there even be a perceived need for regulation in the first place?
Well, let's use maybe a case to talk about that further where there is harm, and let's talk about drugs. Okay, so a lot of people get addicted. A lot of people get children addicted, DUI. There's all sorts of problems with the drugs, very broadly speaking. And yet in regulating and prohibiting as broadly as they have, many states, now it's in the minority, fortunately, continue to prohibit the consumption and possession of cannabis, even among those who have a legitimate medical need, for whom cannabis can be great benefit and a medical, alternative treatment. And so I know many people here in our state and elsewhere who are sometimes openly, but often quietly, breaking that law. They are on the street going to drug dealers. A few weeks ago, I met a drug dealer. This individual is apparently one of the most prominent drug dealers in the state. You would not know it from looking at this person. I was very caught off guard. But it's because a lot of the clientele, these are not just addictive, recreational people. A lot of this is, oh, my mom has cancer, right? And we want to buy enough to juice, cannabis smoothies for her. Or my son has epilepsy and we can't go to Colorado, right, or another state because of whatever circumstances. These people are here, and so they are openly and most often quietly breaking the law. I think there's virtue in that. I think it is an inherent immorality and injustice for the state to do what it's doing right now. That's where the virtue does not exist. I think the virtue in this case is even in this kind of ecosystem or industry where there is a lot of risk and danger. You were asking the question, like, why are they doing this? And I think in the drug case, it makes sense why drugs are illegal. I can at least give the benefit of the doubt to regulators who just want to outright ban all this stuff and think that that's the right approach. It's not, right? People continue to use it. It doesn't decline drug use. It does harm a lot of people. Nevertheless, I can at least, I think as you can, understand why they take that approach. But in doing so, they create a lot of harm, and it's the people breaking those laws for legitimate need that I think are the virtuous ones doing the right thing.
It's always surprising to me how many people, though, rigidly defend the idea that, well, it has to be regulated if it's going to be legitimate. For instance, I don't know if you remember this from a couple of years ago. I used to talk about this on my radio show, the grilled cheese sandwich.
No, I
It's
don't.
a guy in New York City. This is awesome. He had a pager, and you would call his pager, type in your phone number, and then he would call you back and ask your location. And in 15 minutes, he would have a piping hot grilled cheese sandwich delivered to you.
Wow.
And I mean, this is not cheap. It was like $15 for the sandwich, but it was really good. It was very high quality. But the funny thing is, he appropriated some of the methods that drug dealers had been using, you know, for people wanting to score illegal drugs.
Right.
And he was selling grilled cheese sandwiches. Now, mind you, this is without a food handler's permit. This is without a business license and all of these things. And people lost their minds about, well, when somebody comes down sick, you know, what's going to happen then? But it didn't happen.
Yeah.
It was just a guy making people happy with a grilled cheese sandwich on demand. And it was one of the best examples of the black market that I could think of.
Well, and that's personal satisfaction, wanting that sandwich. What about altruism? I think of this story. This made international news a few years ago. Arnold Abbott, down in Florida, 90-year-old guy feeding the homeless. He'd been doing it for like a decade. And the city council started passing all these ordinances saying you need a food handler's permit, you need porta potties, you need this, that, and the other. And he just continued going about his business doing the same thing he'd been doing the entire time. To my knowledge, nothing ever came out in the media of anyone ever being made ill by the food that he served. So I'm pretty certain with all the scrutiny that existed on his case for quite a while that story would have percolated. So it's probably safe to say no one was ever hurt. There were no victims. There were no problems. And so if you can't point to actual harm, then what is the point of, bringing up this argument? Well, what about these people? Like, it's a specious, speculative, potential edge case that never materializes, and yet it's used to turn the exception into the rule, right?
It's the credo of statism, which was explained in a book, The State versus the People. Jay Zellman and I think it was Naomi Wolf. You'll have to forgive me if I get the name wrong of the co-author, but they wrote a book called The State versus the People. And the credo of statism is whatever is not under the control of the state is by definition out of control. And you can think of innumerable examples of people who point to something and say, well, if the state isn't regulating it, then you shouldn't be doing it.
So a great example of regulation that I think of, probably because we're in the middle of a big research project on the issue, is occupational licensure. Same thing, right? It is a highly regulated industry, a presumption of control. You are forbidden from doing this unless you have our permission, unless you jump through these hoops. And there have been many successful challenges led primarily by Institute for Justice, right? Especially tackling the hair braiding issue. So here in Utah, where we're located, there was a case just a few years ago where a woman from Sierra Leone named Justina Clayton had, since the age of 5, she had been braiding people's hair. And her country had a civil war. She immigrated to the United States. She found herself amid all these white people adopting black babies and having no clue how to do their hair. So she started offering her services. And she was reported by an anonymous tipster who threatened her and said, you're not allowed to be doing this. You don't have a cosmetology license, which at the time required 2,000 hours of schooling in a cosmetology school. So she went to the cosmetology board, which of course is staffed by all of her competitors that are cosmetologists who have no incentive, or rather have a disincentive to make exceptions and allow for competitors. And they said, nope, yeah, you have to get 2,000 hours of school. Never mind the fact that none of the cosmetology schools even taught African hair braiding. Never mind the fact that she had been braiding hair longer than cosmetology students at the time had been alive, right? Like, none of that mattered. There was no competency test. There was no nothing. And so she sued and she won. And taxpayers had to, be out like $200,000 in costs. But I think that's a perfect example. Here you have people who are engaging in occupations in a black market who say, I don't recognize your authority. I don't need your permission slips, right? Like, I don't need to comply with that. My neighbor wants me to cut his hair. I'm going to go cut his hair. My neighbor wants a massage or, clip his nails or thread his eyebrow or, landscape designers. You need, here in our state, you need an occupational license, a permission slip to design landscapes. I know there's one state where you need an occupational license to be a florist, right? This stuff's
unbelievable.
This stuff's insane. And what this really shows the point of how arbitrary it is. There's over, I think 1,100 occupations countrywide that require licensure when you add them all up, state to state. But there are only around 60. I've seen different numbers, 40, 50, 60, but there are fewer than 75, I think it's very fair to say, that are licensed in every single state. So these are like physicians and nurses, right? Things like that are licensed in every state. But apart from that, where there's significant human risk involved, right? Everything's all over the map. This shows how arbitrary it is. And if I have a license in Texas and then I move to Utah and they're going to make me go all, they have no reciprocity, there's no competency, I have to jump through all those hoops again. I know one guy who's from another state and he's in a totally different profession making hardly any money because he doesn't have the resources or, the time or the energy to go through all those hoops. I know an immigrant who is from another country and was a barber and is now doing some menial work here because he can't, get a license. It's too difficult. The barrier's too high. And so it's those people who choose to, notwithstanding those regulations, still engage, still offer that practice, still trade with people directly, still, offer their expertise. I think there's virtue in that because I don't see that the state has legitimate authority to say, bow down, kiss the ring, give us permission. I think, Brian, what you brought up is a compelling point that so often the public says, well, what about this? And what if? And there are cases where a cosmetologist can like burn your scalp. And
sure,
there are cases when licensed physicians sew people back up and leave gauze and needles and, other junk inside people's bodies, right? So like there's risk involved, but better that risk be borne by the people involved than by some bureaucrat who doesn't have an incentive to make sure that things are on the up and up.
The danger that I see is that it involves creating criminals where there was no criminal intent and often where there was no harm done. Case in point, Broward County, Florida did a sting a few years ago where they placed ads on Craigslist and they were just saying, simple repair. Hey, we've got an electrical, we got a light switch in my home, which is acting up. Can anybody fix that for me? And there were a bunch of guys, handymen, day laborers, people who knew what they were doing, who answered these Craigslist ads, showed up to fix the light switch. And when they walked in the door, I kid you not, guns in the face, get on the ground, handcuffed and charged with violating because they didn't have a contractor's license. They weren't licensed to do that particular work. And the predictable answer people will give is, well, there are unscrupulous people out there without licenses who will bilk people or do shoddy work. I agree, there are. Why not face that on a case-by-case basis? And if someone's behavior or someone's done damage to somebody else, then hold them accountable for it. But if somebody hasn't and they get the job done, how can that not just be regarded as a mutual contract between people who needed to get something done?
You bringing up that case reminded me of another that happened recently I believe it was in Toronto, and there was this flight of stairs that the community wanted to be built around this slope. I think it was at a park, and the city was quoting this price between $65,000 and $150,000. These were the estimates that the city had received for this job, right? Tons of money for like 8 steps. I mean, it was insane, and so they weren't moving forward. So this retired guy, this was in Toronto, he was sick of the city dragging their feet, so he did it himself. He hired a homeless man, and they built 8 steps, and it cost him $550, right? More than 100 times cheaper than the estimates the city had been given. And you see the photos online. I remember watching a video, and that everything looks sturdy. It looks far better than I could build. Looks like a contractor built it, someone who had, level and math and like it looked like a good job, right? And so city workers, these 3 workers show up in hard hats and reflective vests and power tools and dismantled the entire thing because the city alleged that it was unsafe, right? Like that's insane. And so this is where I think like guerrilla black market stuff is wonderful. Like do it anyways, because what happens? It's like, this is the power of civil disobedience. The power of civil disobedience is in educating people, in showing people the absurdity of the law. I mean, going back to occupational licensure, I remember a protest that some Free State guys did in New Hampshire where they went on to like the Capitol lawn in their state, the grass in front of the Capitol, and the guy clipped another person's fingernails, and then the guy paid him $1. And so and so this violated the law, right? Because there was compensation. This is a subject for another day where it's so silly that the state bans activities for compensation that are totally fine without. So that guy could have voluntarily clipped the other person's nails, but the fact that $1 was transacted,
money changed hands.
we must regulate. But civil disobedience is great in the sense that when it shows the absurdity of an unjust law, it educates people who come more and more to agree. It creates a groundswell of support for, ideally, hopefully, changing the law. I think the staircase example is a perfect one.
It is. And I hope people understand, Connor and I are not advocating, hey, it's every man for himself. It's the law of the jungle. There are certain regulations and there are certain places where government can act legitimately to protect our rights. But there's a lot of stuff that we can solve for ourselves. And so I love that you chose the title, The Virtue of the Black Market, because I think on the whole, it's a pretty virtuous thing. Some people may use it for unvirtuous things, and those unvirtuous things can be dealt with, again, on a case-by-case basis. But if we can solve more of our problems at the lowest possible level, I fail to see how that would be anything but a benefit.
And maybe in conclusion, I'll offer one more example, touching on your idea of solving it at the local level. You can't get much more local than the family. And the example I think of the virtue of the black market is, the little girl on the side of the road selling lemonade, right? In most places, that's a criminal enterprise because you don't have the business permit and the food handler's permit. You haven't paid a fee. You don't have the certificate.
What's your tax ID number?
Exactly, right? And so these little kids don't understand that they're breaking the law. Their parents usually don't understand. It's not inherently understood that these laws even exist, and yet we're supposed to abide by them, right? And so when those cases, much like Arnold Abbott in Florida that's serving the homeless, these other stories come out, people recognize the injustice, right? When the little kids get their lemonade stand shut down, social media erupts at how stupid this stuff is. And so those are the cases that I think show that there is virtue in a black market. I stop at every lemonade stand that I see, in part to support entrepreneurship and kind of, help show the kid, like, here's what it's like to actually make some money and interact, ask them questions. So there's utility there, but I'm also supporting the black market, right? I'm saying, like, you go, girl, like, or boy sometimes, but, keep doing it. This is great. Like, you're selling to a consenting customer. We don't need anyone else. I trust you. I think your parents helped you to mix a decent cup of lemonade. It's not, laced with anything. You look like you're a safe person. So here we go. Right? Like, buyer beware. I don't know.
And if someday they end up selling grilled cheese sandwiches, with a pager and a cell phone, I won't think that's a sign that they necessarily went wrong.
Show notes page for today, you guys, societyandthestate.com/42. Stay tuned next time. Today was the, universe's perfect answer. I need to go read. I've never even read the book, so I need to go catch up. But next episode, we are talking about a book that I have read, Permissionless Innovation. This is a fascinating concept. It actually dovetails, I think, quite nicely with what we're talking about today, about especially the Uber case, moving forward without permission and innovating, and the case for tearing down these regulations so that the market can move forward and improve and satisfy all of our lives. You guys won't want to miss this. Adam Thier from Mercatus joins us to talk about permissionless innovation. We'll see you on the next episode.
Thanks for listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.